Excited to be presenting to you tonight. It's really nice to have an invite from Woodland Dunes, joining you from Chicago. And yeah, it sounds like we had a little bit more snow than you've had up that way, but I think you've had overall much cooler temperatures. And as getting ready to start thinking about the next spawning migration of suckers, I'm kind of glad that there is still some winter weather happening, and hopefully the timing of these migrations are going to happen at sort of our usual expected time. But at any rate, well, as Jessica said, I'm the director of Freshwater Research at Shedd Aquarium. I oversee a team of biologists that are doing work in our local aquatic ecosystems. We have an amphibian restoration biologist, and we also have an urban aquatic ecosystems biologist and a freshwater mussel specialist, in addition to the migratory fishes program that I run. So hopefully I'll give a little plug now. Shedd Aquarium had been closed for a while due to the pandemic, but we just opened our doors again last Saturday at a reduced capacity. So if anybody finds themselves heading down to this area and you're interested in checking out Shedd, there's lots to see, and it's almost like having the place to yourself. But at that, I'll get into the program that you're here for. And I titled it Suckers, Winners of the Best Supporting Fishes Award. And I know it's a little bit different. I can't see everybody's faces, but I want to just start out with some questions, and you can answer yes to yourself or throw some of the answers in the chat. But out of all of you that are attending, how many of you like to fish? So if you like to fish, maybe throw your answer in the chat. And if you like to fish, what are some of the favorite species within the Great Lakes region that you like to catch? And maybe if you're not an angler, but you like fish and you like to eat them, what are some of your favorite Great Lakes fishes to eat? Now, we've talked really in just a short bit about fish that you like to catch and which ones you like to have on your plate. But there's a lot of species that are out there that are not necessarily of recreational or commercial value, but they still have a huge ecological role to play. And it's really these unsung heroes that I want to talk about today and give them some love. So really, I think if I had the choice, I would like to start a Fish Academy awards program. Obviously, these trophies would look different. They'd have fish on them. But this is just an idea in my head, because I think, you know, similar to the Academy Awards that give different awards, like Best Supporting Actors and Actresses, you know, in doing the work that I'm doing, I started to think, well, darn it, these suckers that I study a lot of, I would give them the Best Supporting award. And I'm really here to convince you why I think that these suckers should get these awards, and really hoping I can share a little bit more about their biology and ecology, so that you might think that they deserve that award too. So with that, I'll turn that attention to who the Best Supporting Fishes Award would go to. And when I say suckers, if you're talking under family Catostomidae, that's a pretty broad group with a number of different genuses. But the main species that I'm going to be talking about today are white suckers and long-nosed suckers. Other species that fall under that family Catostomidae, it's pretty diverse. The red horses, bigmouth buffalo, and so on in there. But overall, they're not species that you tend to fish for. But again, I'm going to focus mostly on white suckers and long-nosed suckers that are pictured here. So I'm going to go through a few sucker facts, things that you may or may not know. In terms of the overall volume of all the fishes that are out there in the Great Lakes, and even in some of the other smaller lakes within Wisconsin even, the biomass, if you were to take all the fishes and weigh them suckers would probably outweigh the biomass of all the other species together. And in the Great Lakes too, they're extremely prevalent. And so this is sort of an interesting part, because a lot of the times when we speak about Great Lakes fishes, you hear really about the walleye and the perch and the lake trout and bass, but less so on suckers. But there's so many of them out there. They're food for the masses. At one point too, well, actually a lot of times they're still being stocked as a food source for large sport fish. They're actually prey for a lot of different recreational species. So white suckers are often preyed upon by walleyes, basses, burbot, brook trout, and sea lamprey. And they can also be food for a lot of different birds like bald eagles, herons, loons, and osprey. Even muskies and northern pike can take juvenile suckers. So they're pretty big as far as an important role as a prey item. They are very effective little vacuum cleaners. We've got a little icon of them here, and you can see that their mouth is at the bottom of their faces. So they spend a lot of time at the bottom of the lakes and rivers, and they're eating a variety of aquatic insects, small mollusks, algae, as well as crustaceans. And they're definitely effective at sucking up the food off the bottom. And one of my favorite aspects, and why I particularly am so interested in them, is that they make these incredible migrations in the spring. So not long after ice has come off, you'll start to see in tributaries of all sorts of sizes, from small little creeks like Forget-Me-Not Creek and Two Rivers, to larger rivers like the Kewaunee River or the Menominee and the Kinnickinnick. You can get just all of a sudden so much activity with all these suckers moving in. And you can get anywhere from hundreds to hundreds of thousands to even millions in some of the larger tributaries. And a colleague of mine had referred to them as the wildebeest of the Great Lakes. And I think it's a really good analogy to think of, because when we think of migrating species, most often we start to think of some of the terrestrial, like the wildebeest, or we think of birds that make their incredible migrations, or butterflies like the monarch. But less often we think about the fishes that are right in our backyard. And we've got a lot of different species that make migrations in the Great Lakes to be able to reproduce, and they like to change their habitat for that. And suckers are absolutely very numerous in terms of their migration, and they come into these tributaries in the spring. And in that time, they deposit a lot of nutrients. So from their waste materials, from the deposition of eggs, all that nutrients comes in. And there was a really cool study that was done out of the University of Wisconsin in Madison. The PhD student at the time, Evan Childress, he had blocked off a section of a tributary, and he was taking water samples and analyzing them for phosphorus and nitrogen, and looking at how that changed while the suckers were in there. And sure enough, there was a spike in both phosphorus and nitrogen, and they traced those nutrients and how they were being picked up in the food web. And they saw in that location where the suckers had been, algae grew 2 times bigger, like you'd get 2 times larger algal masses. And they would find even too in caddisfly larvae, the larvae themselves were like, I think it was 9 times larger than caddisflies outside of those areas. So really, again, for such a short time, when they come into these tributaries for anywhere from like a week to 2 weeks, and they have this high impact by depositing all these nutrients. And a lot of the times when we think about fish migrations and the addition of nutrients to a tributary, we often think of salmon. So think of salmon on the West Coast, and they make these migrations to their natal tributaries to spawn. They spawn and they die, and the rotting carcass adds nutrients into the rivers. You might have a grizzly bear come and scoop out the carcass and drag it into the forest and eat what they can off of it. And then any of the other nutrients get taken up into the trees that are around there. And that's great. And that's an important aspect to the ecosystem. But the salmon spawn and then they die. But what's really cool about suckers is that they're iteroparous, meaning that once they've reached their age of maturity, they can spawn year after year. So they're coming in time after time and adding these nutrients. And that, I think, is pretty darn cool. I do like salmon too. They are awesome fish. But a lot of fishes, when they spawn, some of them will build nests. There's a lot of trout that when they spawn, they build nests, or you can think of bass build nests when they spawn. But suckers, their spawning activity, really, they don't build nests. They have minimal disturbance of the substrate. So they're not releasing any nutrients through moving things around that way. Some of the suckers, like white suckers, are important hosts for freshwater mussel species. They're Glaucidia, the little tiny baby mussels. They attach onto the gills of fishes, and it's the fish that swim around. And then when the Glaucidia are ready to drop off, they just fall off, and that's how mussels get moved around. And freshwater mussels, if you don't know, we're talking like the native mussels, not the invasive zebra and quagga mussels. They're some of the most imperiled taxa. So fish that have, or mussels that have very specific fish species as hosts, it's really important for those species to remain abundant so that the mussels can still be able to reproduce and get around. And then if you've heard of this guy named Becker, he wrote a book called Fishes of Wisconsin. He thought quite fondly of suckers, and suggested that more people should be including them in their diets because they're low in cholesterol and high in protein. So some other little sucker facts that you may or may not have known. But then more often, I think we know more about the myths of suckers. If you sometimes go onto fishing blogs, or even in some fishing magazines that have a pretty good reputation, I have seen suckers referred to as trash fish. And this is really a misnomer, I think, for any species of fish, but a lot of different species, gar, are often put into that category. Is anything that doesn't necessarily have a recreational or commercial value. So instead, they're sort of just looked upon as trash species. And I think, given what I told you already in the sucker facts aspect, we know that they're not trash fish, but instead are really bringing a lot of value into the ecosystem. Some anglers think that suckers seek out the eggs of other species to consume. So when they make their migrations, a lot of the time they're in the tributaries at the same time as steelhead or rainbow trout. A study had looked at the stomach contents of suckers, and there was like the odd rainbow trout egg in there. So probably any eggs that were picked up were just incidentally consumed while feeding on other things like the mollusks and crustaceans. So those are some important myths that need to be busted regarding the suckers. So that's why I think they're awesome and they deserve that Best Supporting Fishes award, but we really don't know that much about their biology. And instead, there's a lot of threats to suckers, as well as other non-native species that are not ones that are considered to be sport fish. So there's a lot of stressors at the different life stages because they migrate. Barriers can be a problem. And a lot of times when we think of barriers, we think, oh, well, a dam in a river is absolutely going to stop fishes from being able to get upstream and go to where they need to go. But even more prolific around the Great Lakes are culverts. So anywhere where you've got a road going over a stream, culverts allow the water to travel underneath that roadway. And this is very common. You're not going to put a bridge over a small creek, only over the larger rivers. So there's, I think it's 275,000 culverts around the Great Lakes region. And each culvert really has the potential to be a barrier for migration. This is a photo I had taken on a creek, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4 culverts there. About 2 of them might be passable where there's actually water flowing through. But what happens in the springtime, I'm sure most of you are aware of, is that after the winter, you start to get the warmer temperatures and all the snow starts to melt, and you might get rain, and all that water has to go somewhere. So you'll get all of a sudden these tributaries that normally have like a certain amount of flow, they get flooded and the water's rushing through. And if it's going through a culvert, that ends up sometimes creating a lot of extra velocity to go through this small pipe. And you can get scouring downstream of the tail end of that culvert. And that can eventually scour away enough that you get a bit of a waterfall effect in what's called a hanging culvert. And unless fish are really good swimmers and can kind of jump through, that means that they might not be able to pass in through that culvert and get upstream. So culverts are definitely a concern for a lot of migratory species. Also, environmental contamination, whether it's from industries like with a point source pollution or even agriculture runoff or other types of pollution, can degrade a habitat. We do a lot of things where we fill in creeks too to stabilize banks, and we can reduce habitat that might be available, or take really nice spawning habitat and put boulders in. And like a lot of our fish species in the Great Lakes, non-native species or invasive species can also be a threat to suckers as well. So because of all the amazing things that I've mentioned about suckers and what they do, we really need to learn more about them. And really, this is an important area because since they aren't recreational or commercially fished species, not as much effort has gone towards understanding aspects of their natural history. We know quite a bit compared to some fish species in different parts of the world, where we really don't know much, but we still don't know a whole lot of aspects of, like, how far do they go out in the Great Lakes? Do they stay near shore most of the time? How often are we finding them offshore? Do they go back and forth, like as far as like an individual fish? Do we see the same fish spawning at the same creek year after year? How much mixing is there? So we have a lot to study. And again, this is an important aspect to what I'm going to be talking about now, is how do we get some of the answers to the questions that we have, particularly around their migration, because that's a time that we know that they're playing such a key ecological role. So I'm going to cover some of the different ways that we're doing sucker research. One is to look at the timing of their migrations, which is the phenology. So it's that timing of natural processes. And this I'm going to include the community science aspect that a number of you are a part of, as I saw folks joining in. What is cueing the timing for these fish to know when it's time to make their migration? Is it a cue from the lake water temperature? Is it a water temperature cue coming from the tributaries themselves? Is it a flow that they're picking up on? And some other aspects of materials that are moving out of those tributaries that might make them go, oh, it's time to go now. And then are the fish coming back to the same location year after year to spawn? And if so, then we know that that has some implications for habitat restoration, particularly if there's some culverts that maybe are blocking their way to perfect spawning habitat. And then, yeah, how would we know if a culvert is passable? Because sometimes the water velocity could be too high that only really good swimmers like trout could get upstream, but maybe not so much for suckers that are not as exceptional swimmers. So I'm going to go through those different areas and explain how we're tackling some of these questions. So the big aspect that I want to talk about is the community science aspect of our monitoring program to document the timing of when suckers are showing up in these creeks and rivers to spawn. And so in this picture here, we've got a lot of volunteers from Wisconsin. Jessica and Jim and Titus are in these pictures. And then we have some folks from Door County and from Kewaunee County here as well. I'll get into how the community science program works for those of you who aren't familiar. Got folks of all ages too that are participating, from university age students. We have some folks participating at the Urban Ecology Center in Milwaukee, where they get some younger students out to help participate in the monitoring, as well as we have a lot of retired folks participating in these programs. So I just wanted to start to show some of the faces of the amazing volunteers that help to make this program possible, because there's only one of me, but there's a lot more people that are volunteers and can be able to do the monitoring of these fish migrations. So what it looks like is, well before we know or anticipate that the suckers are going to show up into a local tributary for spawning, I go out and I meet the volunteers and provide a data sheet, a bunch of data sheets, and we install some of the monitoring equipment. So there's a piece of rebar that gets hammered into the substrate. And then I attach a big staff gauge, which just looks like a giant ruler. And then around the half cinder block, there's an actual data logger attached to it. And it takes a reading of the water temperature as well as the water depth every 15 minutes. And the water depth reading is a nice surrogate for flow. So if there's been a big rain event, you're going to see the depth of the water increase. And if you aren't getting rain events and the water level is decreasing, again, that gives us some indication of flow. So we get high resolution data by the data logger taking lots of readings every 15 minutes. But the volunteers, when they go out to monitor the creek, they're recording all sorts of environmental variables. So writing down what's the date, and we monitor again, ideally somewhere around a week to hopefully not more than 2 weeks before the fishes show up. But sometimes I get a little bit eager and have people monitoring almost a month before the fishes show up. We don't want to miss them. So every day going out and monitoring, writing down the date, the time of day. It's best to do it during the daytime when you can see, since the volunteers are just using their eyes to observe for the fishes. What is the weather like? And the weather is important as far as being able to give some indication, like if it was raining or snowing, it might disturb the water surface and make it not so easy for you to see if there are fish in there. What's the depth of the water? So they take a reading from that giant ruler and write it down. That's a fail safe in case my data logger gets lost somehow or stops working. I can use that at least to give me an idea of how much the water level fluctuated. And then I asked to give some indication of how clear the water is. Can you see to the bottom of the creek or river? If so, yes, that's great. That means you're likely to see the suckers if they're in there. And then, yeah, do you see the suckers, yes or no? And if so, how many do you observe? So we typically choose locations where we know suckers do come in to spawn, and we have some idea of picking a location where there's maybe some point of elevation that gives you more of a bird's eye view to look in and be able to see them. So, in terms of the sites and the locations, we want to know ultimately over time, is climate change potentially shifting when these suckers are showing up to spawn? And as I mentioned, because there is such a tight reliance of the rest of the food web, the algae, the aquatic invertebrates getting nutrients from the suckers, if they show up to spawn and the other aspects of the food web, like the algae and the aquatic invertebrates, if they're not ready for those nutrients, then it's basically like, preparing a buffet feast, but you don't have any guests making reservations at your restaurant to eat there. So that could have some serious cascades as far as the food web goes. So we want to know, is climate change, because it can change the water temperature, and that's a really important factor for fish. Are those suckers shifting when they show up in these creeks? So we want to be able to get a real latitudinal spread in monitoring different locations. So in the picture here with the map, all the yellow pins are monitoring locations. So we've got sites in Highland Park, Illinois, through South Milwaukee, Manitowoc, Two Rivers, Kewaunee, and then through the Door County Peninsula. And then we have sites on the south shore of Lake Superior as well. And you can see a real variety of tributaries from smaller ravine creeks to larger rivers, some more influenced by agriculture, some with lots of forests around them. And again, even in the Milwaukee area, some really urban areas. And for those of you who haven't participated in sucker monitoring or really haven't looked at creek, you might think, well, how easy is it to see these fish if they're there? Well, we've got this amazing drone footage by one of the volunteers in Door County, Joe Taylor. He took this at one of the tributaries, and each of those little airplane looking fishes in there are suckers. There are long-nosed suckers in there, and you can really see clearly. You could actually, from these videos, count how many fish are in there. So while we're not coming in necessarily from that much of a bird's eye view, you can distinguish suckers from other species like trout that would be in there because of the way their pectoral fins sit. And you're probably hopefully watching the video and not me, but I'm making a little airplane sort of shape with my arms. So you can tell when the suckers are in there. So, oops, did I go too fast? Oh, so that's the community science program. And again, ultimately, when it comes to documenting the phenology or the migration timing, a lot of times when you think of volunteers participating in those surveys, you can think of like the Audubon's Christmas bird count surveys that go back like a long time ago, or like documenting the monarch butterfly migrations. But less so are there regular community scientists that participate in fish migration monitoring. So this is something I think that we can replicate throughout the Great Lakes on both the US and Canada side of the lakes. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for being able to document what's going on in our tributaries, and especially how it relates to climate change and putting that context right in our own backyards and why it matters so much. So through our Shedd Research social media, I always try to give shout outs to the volunteers that are collecting all this amazing data. It is not always easy to get to the sites. This was from 2018. My volunteers up in Door County at Rebolt Creek, one, she's like, I can't miss monitoring. So she cross-country skied into the area after I think they had like over a foot of snow fall just so she could be able to get out there and do some monitoring. So that's how dedicated a team of community scientists I have helping to collect the data. And again, I'm just so immensely grateful. We've been able to get quite a bit of publicity for the work that we're doing together to collect this information. And I think that's a really great way to shed a light on the importance of the fishes that are in our backyard and local waters. So I'm going to cover really briefly a little bit more of the research that I'm doing. And I mentioned looking at how often do you get the same fish, adult fish coming back to the same location to spawn year after year. One of the easiest ways for us to track movements of individuals is by putting an electronic tag in them. So I don't know how many of you have cats or dogs at home, but if they are microchipped, well, we're using the same technology right now to study the migrations of the suckers. So they've been microchipped with the same type of tag. It's called a PIT tag, which means passive integrated transponder. Basically, how it works is when it swims over an antenna, there's a little electromagnetic switch that turns on, and it can read the unique ID of that tagged individual. They're really inexpensive. They only cost like a few dollars versus some of the fancier types of electronic tags that you can put in fish that are closer to a $300 price tag per individual. So it's not too expensive to see what would happen if you tag some fish and find out whether or not they show up again. So that's what I did in 2017 in one tributary in Door County, Wisconsin. I thought, well, I'm going to put 100 pit tags out, 50 adult male suckers, 50 adult females, and let's see who comes back in 2018. And so with a little bit of equipment, a small antenna about the size of a looking glass, started to document who returned. And we had 50 out of the 100 suckers come back. I think that probably there was more than 50 out of the 100, but at the same time, because I was seeing the fish coming back, I thought, well, I'm going to put an additional 200 pit tagged fish out there so that I'd have more individuals to track over time. And in 2019, we documented 204 out of the 300 fish had come back to spawn in the same location. And then last year, I was able to set out my equipment back in 2018 in preparation for 2019. I had purchased some larger 2-foot square antennas and was able to deploy a couple of those in the creek as well as a submersible antenna. So I was much more confident that in 2019, we didn't miss any of the fish that returned. And then last year, because the equipment is autonomous and collects data, whether I'm there or not, I was able to pop up from Chicago, drop the equipment in. It's run off of extension cords from a couple of residents' houses along this creek. And I drove back to Chicago and let the data collect while I was safely working from home. And again, we had 176 out of the 300 fish return. So that's pretty cool. Here's some shots. This was from 2018 when I still had the smaller antenna. You can see that not only are suckers cool for all the ecological reasons I described earlier, but there's also, you can see a fish swimming through the antenna. So they are really, they have all sorts of tricks up their sleeves. So that's a whole bunch of white suckers that you can see in this creek. And then I've just got a few other photos here, some beautiful adult white suckers sitting right next to one of my antennas and logging lots and lots of data, which is pretty cool. So this year passed in 2020, even though I wasn't able to be up there checking in on equipment, the residents that lived along the creek were able to check my equipment for me and would take pictures of the equipment each day and email it to me. So they were taking a look at the reader that would pick up the information on the tagged fish. And much like when you go to the grocery store and you scan the groceries, it logs all the barcodes. Well, similarly, as the fish swim over the antennas, it records the date and time stamp that that individual fish swam over the antenna. So they would send me these pictures, and I could start to look at the fish IDs that were showing up there, and how many detections. On this particular one, it had 903 readings, and it always would show the last 3 tags detected. So this was all the same fish each time detected here, but I was able to start, going through the 300 fish I had tagged and start going, oh, yep, that one was tagged in 2017. This one is a male that was tagged in 2018. And it was a really nice thing to do back and forth with those amazing residents that let me power the equipment from their house via an outside extension cord. So that was really cool. And I did mention too, we can start to understand where you have potential barriers to migration. We can start looking at how stressful is it for fish if you're trying to get upstream, but you encounter an impassable barrier. Do you keep trying to get upstream? And are you swimming fast in the higher velocity water downstream of this culvert? And are you trying to jump up? Is this something that could be stressful for you and would relate to maybe your success overall as an individual? We know stress isn't good for humans. Stress isn't great for any animal. So if it's something where they're putting all this energy trying to get upstream, that might mean that they end up dying in the creek because they're too exhausted. Maybe they don't end up spawning at less suitable habitat downstream. And if they don't spawn and they're ready to, that can have an impact on population. So something that we have as a tool in our toolbox as biologists is being able to take blood, again, similar to humans. If something's going, if you're not feeling well and you go to the doctor, one of the first things they like to do is to take blood, because you can get a lot of information from a blood sample. So we can take blood from a fish non-lethally, just by, again, using very similar techniques to what they do in humans, to draw some blood. And then we've got these point of care devices. We can use things like diabetics would use their glucose meter. We can look at glucose in fish. Athletes a lot of times will look at the amount of lactic acid that's built up after exercise. We can use the same type of thing for looking at exercise and fish. And then similar to what vets use, you can get these fancy cartridges that can look at ion levels, things like potassium and chloride and so on in the blood levels. And we can do that stuff right creek sides to start getting a look at, oh, is this a stressful event? So these are things that we'll continue to build on with the data collection, understanding more about suckers and their migration timing, as well as barriers to their migration. So continue to collect this information and build on the community science program. I'd like to be able to, again, like I mentioned, make this be something that is a program that people could participate in, whether they're on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan or the western shore, or up in Canada. Because when we're looking at climate change and trying to determine if there's any effects in the or shifts in the timing of the migration, it's nice to start to have data from way back, like 50 years ago, rather than trying to compare data from 2017 to 2021. So any agencies like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Wisconsin DNR on the Canadian side, Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada, who's got data on suckers and the timing of like when they've showed up to tributaries to spawn, and use that as some background data to make comparisons. Once the tag suckers that I have leave the creek, I don't know where they go. So I'm hoping to be able to put in some of the fancier, more expensive transmitters into fish so we can find out where they go when they leave the creek. And do they go into the Green Bay portion of Lake Michigan, or are they going out into the big body of water? How much mixing do they do? Do they stay with the same individuals, outside of the spawning season? Do they do a lot of moving around, or are they kind of more homebodies and just stay close to shore? That's all information that would be really neat to learn about. And again, spend more time reaching out to not only adults, but also to high school students, elementary school students, and get people to understand more about the value of the fishes that maybe they haven't heard so much of. So that's a really important aspect. And one way that anybody can participate in contributing data to fisheries managers and biologists working in the Great Lakes is through the use of Shedd's Great Lakes Fish Finder app. It's free for both Android and iPhones. You can find it in the app stores for either of those. And basically, Shedd developed this app. It's a project that's nested under iNaturalist. iNaturalist is an app that a lot of people know of that is used for logging data on a variety of taxa, whether it's birds, plants, insects. But what we were seeing is that there's not a lot of data on fishes. And we thought, well, if we could do this fish finder app, we can help promote logging data on fishes. So whether it's fish that you see walking by a creek and you take a picture, or if you're an angler and you go out just fishing locally and you catch something, you can log the species and the location. So that's something that I'll throw out there and we can talk about more. And then just lastly, I just want to acknowledge all the different volunteers that have participated in the program since 2017 and all the great locations that have helped facilitate this, including the Woodland Dunes Nature Center and Preserve. So yeah, with that, again, I'll just remind you, Shedd is open if you're looking to get out for a visit. We'd love to see you. And there's a lot of different virtual programs too that we offer. So I guess if anybody has questions, I'll shut this down and answer some questions.